Hi, I'm Nick Glaves. I'm the Managing Director of Red Stag Media. And today in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the thorny topic of media relations. Let's start off by looking at what media relations actually is. Well, the clue's in the title, really. It's about the relationship you have with your target media, the relationship you have with individual journalists and reporters, with editors, and the people who ultimately you want to sort of influence to write about your company, about your products, and publish the press releases that we spoke about in an earlier video. Media relations is sometimes seen by people as a difficult thing to negotiate. It doesn't have to be. There are certain pitfalls and certainly things that you need to avoid doing, and there are some things that you need to do to have good working relationships with journalists, and in this video we're going to explore those essentially. So we're going to start out, I suppose it's going to be in the format of a few tips, but we're going to broadly talk around those so you can get the best out of getting your news out there and ensuring it gets published in the right way. So the first tip really is to identify the priorities of the people that you're trying to build relationships with. If you look at PR simply as a way of enhancing the brand, your business brand, or enhancing the awareness of your products, you're probably not going to get the best out of it. You don't really want to look at it so much as a marketing exercise for your company. Ultimately it is that, but if you only see it as that, you're really not going to get the best out of it. The way to get the best out of media relations and out of working with journalists is to sort of alter your thinking and start to think along the lines of what they need out of it. The priority for any journalist in any publication or on the radio or on television ultimately is to give interesting insight and tell interesting stories to their readership or their viewers. That's their priority. That's what they are employed to do. They're not employed to market your business. So what you really need to do when starting to think about working with journalists is look at it from their perspective. What kind of stories is going to be of interest to their target market, and how ultimately can you tailor your corporate messages, your commercial messages, the messages around your business into stories that are going to resonate with journalists. Journalists do need content. Let's not make any bones about that. They're in the industry of telling stories, and they need stories. And sometimes they find those stories through contacts, and sometimes they find those stories through farmers and tip-offs and all the different things, different ways they get stories. But a lot of stories, particularly in a commercial sector, in niche and trade publications, come from PR. So using PR and talking to PR people is something that they probably do on a daily basis. So they will be used to doing that. And people who know their craft and are good in PR are very good at looking at what the journalist wants and looking at what their objectives are and using their own messaging and their press releases to feed into that, and that ultimately leads to success. The next thing to really to understand about journalists is that they're busy people. We're all busy people. They're not necessarily more busy than anybody else working in business or media or whatever, but they are busy people and don't like having their time wasted. So if you're going to go and pitch a story to a journalist, make sure you do it concisely. Work a little bit on an elevator pitch. Don't be robotic and ring a journalist up and sort of go through a script, but you've really got to be able to articulate the story you want to tell quickly. And the test that we really often use for this kind of thing is whether you could tell your mate down the pub in a sentence or two what the story was about. If you struggle to do that, you either haven't got a story or you haven't got your pitch sorted out. And unless you can get across really quickly the point of that story, the chances are they're going to shut off, they're not going to listen, and you really dent your chances of getting a story published. Another thing to really consider is how are you going to make contact with a journalist. There's a number of ways now. Obviously the most direct is to ring that journalist or email. Some people now quite like direct approaches through social media. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. Personally speaking, if I've got a big story, I really want to ring people because I know I can gauge their reaction. And I can hear how excited they are about it, and we can discuss it. Email doesn't necessarily have the advantage of being able to discuss things, but if you get on the phone to journalists, you can discuss the story, you can discuss the angles. They might tell you extra things that they need that you haven't got. So that's a really useful way of doing it. But think about timing. Like, for example, if a publication comes out on a Friday, it's a weekly publication, don't try ringing them on a Thursday when they're trying to meet deadlines, or even sort of Wednesday afternoon. because they're fighting to reach their deadlines. They've got stories to write. By that point, they've probably got all the stories in the can they're going to write, but they need to get them in for their deadline, for the final print deadline, and they're not going to have time to speak to you at that point, or it's very unlikely. You might hit lucky because a story might have fallen down, and you might be able to sort of crowbar your story in, but more than likely they're just going to want to get you off the phone because they've got a story to write or several stories to write before the final deadline. If it's a daily publication and there's online as well as print, then they might have a series of stories that they've got to publish online on any one particular day. So they've got a series of deadlines throughout the day. That can be harder to work out when the best time to ring them is. Probably in that instance, first thing in the morning, they're getting the news agenda together for the day. If you've got some story ideas you can throw into the pot, they'll probably be grateful. That's one time, or even try later on in the afternoon for the next day, so they can write the story the next day. Because by that point, if they've made all their deadlines and they're not quite so busy in the afternoon, you may well then have a chance to speak to them. Ultimately, when it comes to things like that, it's a bit of trial and error. Sometimes you'll ring them and they'll ask you to ring back another time. That's fine, respect that. But when it comes to very clear deadlines, as I say, like sort of a weekly publication that comes out on a particular day, don't ring them the day before expecting to get a story in that week's publication, because the chances are you'll just get short shrift. One thing to bear in mind is that, we've done a previous video on how to write a press release, or certainly tips to improve your press releases. And if you use a press release as a way of dispensing news, one thing to really bear in mind is that it's very unlikely to actually appear in the publication in the same form at which you wrote it and sent it. The reason for this is ultimately, when you send a publication or give somebody a tip-off or anything, it's totally up to the publication, first of all, if they use that story at all. It's their publication. They get to decide what stories go in there. They also get to decide how those stories are presented. So they might find a different angle in your press release which they prefer and rewrite the story along that angle. Or they might just want to put their own stamp on it. You've not written it in the house style. So house style is, every publication has a house style, and that's how they write things. You may not have written it particularly close to that. They may want to change some of the quotes around to tell the story in a slightly different order if they see fit, and that's entirely their prerogative. It's their publication. They can do with your press release essentially as they like, other than change the nature of it. So they can't start, for example, to mess around with direct quotes or any of the factual information, but they can change the order of it, they can change the wording of it, and they can ultimately craft it in a style which more suits their publication. So if you get a story in a publication, you get some editorial coverage, but you open that up and find that it's very, very different to the press release you sent in, that's perfectly normal. What you don't want to do at that point is go ringing the journalist up and saying, why have you done this? We sent it in this way, this is how we expected it to be published. That isn't your right. It's the right of the publication essentially to run that story how they see fit, and they will do so. And I would expect that from the start. One tip which is really likely to get you on the wrong side of a journalist, essentially, is to slip into the conversation that you're doing a significant amount of advertising with that publication. In the past, it was always thought that the editorial section of a publication, be it a newspaper, a magazine, or commercial television or radio, was separate from the advertising and from the commercial arm of that business. And that still rings true to a great extent. However, there is, we all know that there's sometimes some crossover in respect of that because people have to run businesses, and that's a fact of life. But using that as leverage to try and get a poor story into a publication is not going to do you any favours at all. If you start to say to journalists, we're spending X amount, or we're advertising this week, or one thing or another as an attempt to get a poor story in, or even just to influence the journalist generally, you're probably again going to get short shrift. Or if that journalist, to be honest, is worth their salt, you should do, because that's no way to go to try to put pressure on journalists, and the chances are you're going to end up being slightly resented for that, and they're not going to be happy to hear from you in the future. So be very careful when it comes to suggesting that you have advertising spend with the publication. Ultimately, any story that you pitch to a journalist should stand up by itself. It should be a good story. If they don't want to run it, it's perhaps because it's not the right time, or it's just not a strong enough story. And to be honest, if that's the case, as a PR person, then that's your issue. You need to go away and either strengthen that story or abandon it and find a new story to tell. But don't try to sort of strong-arm journalists into publishing things because your company might be advertising a great deal with them that week, that month, that year. It's not a great way of building relationships. Media relations is called media relations because it's a two-way thing. You are attempting to get something published in either online or a broadcast or in a print publication, and that journalist may well be very, very happy to use your press release or your story, and that's great. But what you may also find is that they need more information about that. We put out press releases that we think tell a full narrative, but actually news is a very subjective thing. And a journalist might just want an extra nugget of information about a particular part of the press release. They might want to speak more extensively to the people who are quoted in the press release. Very often quotes are very controlled, can be quite short. But if that journalist finds particular interest in, say, a farmer case study that we've used, they may ask you to put them in touch with that person. In that instance, help them out. You're asking something of them. You want something to be printed in their magazine or reported on their TV program or radio station. You're asking that of them. Have the courtesy, therefore, to, if they come and ask you for information, to enable them to publish that, to get them that information in a timely fashion. It's really important that you do that because that demonstrates your professionalism as a PR or a PR person, somebody trying to get coverage. It helps them out. It fosters good relationships. If there are things which they ask for which you can't provide, such as financial information which might be commercially sensitive or anything around particular IP, then explain that. Have an open conversation. Say, look, we can't unfortunately give you that information because it's commercially sensitive. We can't give you that information because it infringes some IP, or we don't want to give that away. And most of the time, 9 times out of 10, they will understand that and proceed generally. But what is not a good approach is to ignore that request. You need to go back and explain why it is they can't have that information rather than just trying to sweep it under the carpet and hoping they don't notice or hoping they don't ask. They've asked for a reason, so give a reason why you can't allow them to use that information. And as I say, 9 times out of 10, they'll accept that and move on and everything will be fine. Looking like you're trying to sweep it under the carpet might look like you're trying to hide something, and that might obviously breed a bit of mistrust, maybe in the story that you're trying to get them to publish, and in any future communication. So it's important that you're transparent and clear with journalists when you're trying to get stories published. Here's an interesting one. I've been a business reporter at a busy daily newspaper, and I've been a PR for more than a decade now. So I've sat on both sides of the fence of media relations, and one of the most interesting and much debated phrases is off the record. So what does this mean? Now, you might think this is quite a sort of niche thing to bring into a video of this type. Principally, as we've explained, we work with the agri media, so it's not necessarily a phrase that is associated with that. It's more politics and hard news in that respect. But it is worthy of discussing it briefly. And what does off the record mean, and what does it mean to different people? Because it means different things in different contexts. So most people assume if I were to tell you something off the record, it means you can't publish that. But some people have been caught out in that respect, because what a lot of people take that to mean is that you can't, you can publish that or you can use that information, but you can't give the source, you can't give my name. So somebody might have said to me as a journalist, or told me a piece of information that they claim is off the record. And I might go and check that out with another source and then put it into a story. And then they come back to me saying, well, that was off the record, that should never have been published. Well, to me, that doesn't mean the same thing. That means you've told me that information, and I'm a journalist, so you've told me it for a reason. So I'm going to use that information, but I'm not going to say you told me it. So the tip there essentially is that if you absolutely don't want something to go into the media, don't tell a journalist. Even if you say it's off the record, they might take it to mean, okay, we can publish it, but in actual fact, as long as we don't reveal where we got it from, we're safe and sound. So people have been caught out by that before. So if you want to give that information, but you don't want to reveal yourself as the source, off the record is a great thing to say. If you just don't want that information in the public domain, just don't say it. that will ensure that it can never be published. So my final tip in regards to fostering good media relations and working well with the media that you want to target, and this relates back to an earlier point about it being the media's decision and the publication's decision how they present your story, is not to get annoyed if it's not presented in exactly the way that you want it to be. As I said earlier, this is their prerogative. If there are inaccuracies in that story, if they've misquoted somebody, or if the technical data or the statistics are for some reason incorrect, then you absolutely have a right of reply to politely go back and point those out. That's absolutely fine. It is not okay, it's not right for a publication to publish untrue things about your business or about your brand or about you individually. But a phone call to the journalist to point those out, particularly if it's online and it can be changed quickly, is usually all it takes to sort that situation out. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult if it's in print, and you might have to speak to the publication, see if things can be rectified. But the thing really to point out, the important thing here is really not to lose your temper, not to get annoyed, cast aspersions, or do anything to really damage that relationship. Because if you burn those bridges, it is difficult to engender any future trust and get anything published. And mostly, the vast majority of journalists are trying their best to be accurate and get the stories out there that are true and accurate. They don't want the headache of being told things are wrong and having to correct things, so they will try their utmost to get things right. Sometimes we're all human, sometimes mistakes happen. If you burn your bridges with a publication and you either want to get coverage in the future or something were to go wrong within your own business or your products, you're really only ever likely to get negative coverage off that publication in the future, and obviously that's a headache you can do without. So however they present your story, don't go back angry, don't go back shouting the odds or threatening anything. Go back in the spirit of reconciliation, putting things right, and move forward from there, because otherwise it could have poor consequences for you in the future. So those are a few tips about how to foster good media relations, and if you follow those, you should have no problems whatsoever. Particularly if you go back, obviously, if you haven't seen it, and watch the video about press releases, and you combine that with the tips about media relations, you really should have the tools to put together a comprehensive media strategy, PR strategy, and attain some great coverage going forward. Hi, I'm Nick Glaves. What am I?
Managing Director.
I hate it. Right, okay. Hi.